Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Gustavo, and if you were around last year edition for MongoDB.live, you might remember we launched mongocli. For the last year, my team and I have been working really hard in adding new features as well as incorporating all your feedback. So today, we're going to present you with some of those changes. For today, we're going to be talking a bit about what's mongocli, just a bit of a refresher, as well as the things you're going to need to get started with this demo. Then we're going to go into a really interesting demo for the mongocli with Ops Manager. And then finally, we're going to go over some of the features that we are not going to be directly covering in our demo today. So what's mongocli? Well, mongocli aims to provide users with a friendly and modern command line interface to achieve many of the management-related tasks of your MongoDB infrastructure. mongocli will let you interact with both Atlas, Ops Manager, or Cloud Manager from the terminal, so you don't have to go clicking through the UI. It's going to be just simple one-line commands that you can copy, paste, save, bundle together as scripts to help you automate many of your Ops Manager tasks. So what you're gonna need today, first and foremost, you're gonna need an instance of Ops Manager available. In this case, I have already set up Ops Manager beforehand. I'm not gonna go into the details on how to install and configure Ops Manager. We already have a couple of videos in our booth that will show you in more details how to do those things. Let me tell you that it's gonna be an interesting demo because I have Ops Manager in a really minimal setup. We don't have any users, we don't have any organizational groups, and we're gonna be doing all of this through mongocli. The next thing is that you wanna get your hands on mongocli. You can head over to mongodb.com/try/download mongocli. And in there, you're going to find a couple of links for the different operating systems and architectures that we support. Another option, if you have Mac OS and Homebrew installed, then you can just run brew install mongocli. That will keep mongocli updated through brew in your machine. If you need more details or you want to find out all the different ways that you can install mongocli in your machine, then head over to tinyurl.com/mongocli, where you will have our documentations on all these different ways to set up mongocli. All right, now hopefully you have mongocli and you have your Ops Manager instance. Then what we're gonna do today, like I mentioned, I have an Ops Manager instance where I don't have any users. Then through the CLI, we're gonna create our first user. This user will become what is known as a global owner, which has complete admin control of Ops Manager. Then we're gonna create an organization and project where we're gonna then deploy a sample replica set with mongocli. All right. We're gonna do this a bit of live demo, so bear with my typos. This is like I mentioned, this is a clean Ops Manager installation. It's running on an Ubuntu machine. I don't have anything special beyond having installed Ops Manager. So let's start with installing mongocli. One of the ways that you can get mongocli in your system, in the case of Ubuntu, is that you can use MongoDB repos that we already have for MongoDB server. In this case, I'm going to be using the repo for 4.4, but if you already have 4.2 set up, we also publish mongocli in 4.2 and 4.4, and eventually once 5.0 is available, we'll also be publishing there. So let's start with adding the signature keys of our repo. Then let's add the repo list to our installation. Let's do a little refresh of the available sources. And finally, let's get mongocli installed. Yeah, like I mentioned, small typos all the time. All right, we got MongoCLI installed. We can run MongoCLI -- This will give us that is MongoCLI 1.16.0. This is the latest version that we have available at the time of this recording. Another option that you have, you can do MongoCLI help, and that gives you a top level idea of the commands that you have available. Like we have been saying, today we're going to be focusing in Ops Manager. So, given that with Ops Manager, you control where Ops Manager is running, you're going to have to tell the CLI where that instance of Ops Manager is. Normally, I will tell you run Mongo CLI config, and that will guide you in all the steps that you need to set up Mongo CLI. But since we don't have users and we don't have API keys, we have to be a bit more creative. So one of the ways that you can do Mongo CLI setup is with env variables. In this case, we're going to use Mongo's MCLI Ops Manager URL, pointing to localhost. Like I mentioned, I'm already connected to the machine where I have Ops Manager running. We're going to use localhost, which is where Ops Manager is. This env variable is going to be used by Mongo CLI to always point to this Ops Manager instance. So now that we have that out of the way, the next thing we're going to do is create our first Ops Manager user. For that, we have a special command. It's called Mongo CLI OM, short for Ops Manager, owner create. We're going to give it an email. This is an invalid email for my particular case. But please be mindful of using valid emails because they're going to be helpful in case you need to recover your password. Then I'm going to give it my name, and then we're going to create an access list. In the case of this command, along with the first user, you also get a couple of API keys. The way that our API keys work is that you only allow to use them for from certain locations. Since I'm connecting from localhost, I'm gonna allow for my API list to be using from this machine in particular. So let's run this. It's gonna ask me for a password. This is the password that you will normally use through the UI. So let's pick a somewhat secure password. Okay, and as easy as that, like you get a confirmation message that the owner has been created, you get a personal API key, which I have to remind you, they have been deprecated for a while now. We still return them for backward compatibility reasons, but you should focus on the pragmatic API keys. In this case, we get a public section and a private section. Keep those secure because they are comparable to a password. But I'm going to keep them there because we're going to use them for our next step. So you heard me saying before, we want to set up Mongo CLI to have access to Ops Manager. The best way to do that is with Mongo CLI config. We're going to now proceed with that step because now we have API keys. We indicate that we want to use Mongo CLI with Ops Manager. The first thing you get is what's the Ops Manager URL. Since we have that env variable exposing localhost, the config is reusing that. In this case, it's safe for us to say, yeah, we want to use that. Then we get a public API key that we can get from our previous owner creation. Private API key. At default organization, we don't have any organization yet, so it's showing blank, and we can leave it blank. Same with project, and we are done. Now our Mongo CLI it's set up to interact with Ops Manager using our API keys and our base URL. We've been saying that we want most of our resources are scoped to organizations and projects. So that's the next thing that we want to do. Let's create a organization. We use MongoCLI IAM organization create. I'm gonna call it my org. You are free to pick up more descriptive name. We get back an ID. We can use from the previous step, CLI config set org ID. What this is gonna do is that if in any command you are supposed to provide an org ID, like I mentioned, some resources are scope. If we set up in our profile an org ID, then we don't need to use an org ID for a particular command because it's going to use the default from our configuration. So let's set that up. Now, we want to create a project for that organization. That's kind of the structure that we have. We have multiple organizations, and each organization has multiple projects. So we want to create this project for that organization. Since I have set up the org ID as a default, I don't need to provide an org ID here. So that becomes optional. At the same time, we have different ways of outputting information. And right now I want to take the opportunity to show you that we can, with -o JSON, which output JSON, we can output the JSON information here. So let's create this project. As you see, now we have JSON information. The reason I wanted to show you the JSON is because we're gonna use a couple of things here to help us later. We want this ID, which is the ID of the project. And we want the agent API key. So if you're not familiar with Ops Manager, the way that Ops Manager handles automation, monitoring, and backup is through the MongoDB agent. It's kind of a companion application that you install where you want to have MongoDB running. And this, along with Ops Manager, takes charge of all these different automation, monitoring, and backup tasks. So we want to keep this agent API key because we're going to be using that to set up an agent. So let's take a note of that and take a note of our project ID. All right, so now we have our global owner user, we have our organization, and we have our projects. Having done that, we can then proceed to install this automation agent that we've been talking about. So the way you can install it is that you can download it from Ops Manager. Like I mentioned, we have, sorry, I have the wrong link here with an underscore. So we have Ops Manager running on localhost. We can take that path that we have there. It's MongoDB MMS Automation Agent Manager. Latest will be the latest version available of the agent, which is what I want to install right now. If you have a particular version, you can change latest for that particular version that you want to use. But this is a quick, easy way to, if you are scripting this, get an idea that you could combine all these different commands in one single bash script and run it as a whole. So let's get latest. That should get me the right file. Perfect. And now let's install our friend, the agent. All right. So that's the Ubuntu or Debian installation command. We want to set a couple of things in our agent. This is why I wanted to show you the previous step of having the JSON API keys and group ID. So we were going to use those for setting up an agent. Let's get that project ID here. And then we want to set the agent key here. Now, similar to how the CLI works, you need to tell the agent where your Ops Manager installation is. In this case, localhost. We are done here. Finally, it's a good idea to give the agent access to the folders where you're going to be installing MongoDB data and logs. In this case, I'm going to create a root folder called data. I'm going to assign it to give ownership to the MongoDB user. And finally, we get to start our MongoDB agent service. If we did this correctly, now that agent should be communicating with Ops Manager, and then through the CLI, we have a command where we can see all our agents, all our agents that are available for Ops Manager. This is an interesting error. I forgot to run one command, like we mentioned with the org ID. In this case, this command requires a project ID. Similar to what we were saying with our ID, that we have two options. We can say project ID and use the ID that we got from the ID, the project creation. I personally prefer to have some defaults or safe, so I don't have to be using the project ID flag all the time. So I'm going to do that now, same way that we did with the org ID. We do config project ID and then that ID. Sorry, and config set. That's what happened with live demos. Sometimes you forget a little thing. So there you go. That should set up the project ID as a default. We try running our servers command again, and there you go. As you can see, this is where our agent is running, which is the namespace of this machine. Now that agent is available for monitoring, backup, and the most interesting feature, which is management of MongoDB clusters. One of the new features that we have added is that now through CLI, you can enable monitoring. So let's try and do that now. Mongo CLI, Ops Manager, monitoring, enable. Enable requires what's the host name that you want to enable monitoring for. That's where your agent is running. So you have to tell for this agent, enable that agent to perform monitoring. So let's do that. Once you run this command, some changes are running in the background in Ops Manager to enable monitoring. You could go and check out this in the UI, but one interesting way of doing it as well is that you can do Mongo CLI OM automation watch. Changes deployed successfully. The changes were faster than me typing the command. So now we should have monitoring available in our system. All right. Having done that, now where it gets interesting is how can now get a cluster for MongoDB. I have previously set up a configuration for a cluster. We can see it here. JSON. So this is a really simple, minimal 3 members replica set. We have the name, the versions, the feature compatibility version. We have the list of process. They all gonna be running in the same machine. I have defined where our data and logs are gonna be. And finally, we have our ports. Really minimal, really simple, just for this example. there's a whole range of configurations. I recommend you checking out our docs, where you can see all the different options that are available for you, both as a replica set or as a sharded cluster. But for this example, let's go with this replica set. All right, we have, how do we use this configuration file? So we have, again, MongoCLI, Ops Manager, clusters, create, and just for demonstration, how do we use create? So we can use help. You can see what the create command does, and then you have a couple of flags. In this case, we want to use the file flag pointing to our cluster JSON. Since we have a project ID already set as a default, we don't need to provide that. And then we can run this. So again, changes are being applied. We can proceed and watch how our automation configuration changes. We, in this case, this takes a bit longer to enable monitoring. So we get this nice spinner. Changes have been deployed. You should have now a Mongo cluster available for you. We can check this again, doing a little bit of commands with the CLI, Mongo CLI clusters. Sorry, I forgot Ops Manager. There you go. That's the replica set that we just deployed. If we want to also check Mongo CLI Ops Manager servers list. Now we have, if you remember from before, we had no processes running on that server. Now we have an active server running or replica set. That's all that I wanted to show you quite in depth today, how from a blank sort of state Ops Manager, we can fully automate the creation of a cluster from scratch, all through CLI. I have done this command by command, but I think that one of the interesting possibilities is that you could pipe all these different commands, especially if you combine, like we saw with the JSON output. You could use really interesting scripting to get from just having Ops Manager to ending up with an Ops Manager with a cluster, all without ever going through the UI. All right, I'm gonna finish this presentation of the terminal here. I'm gonna go back to my slides. All right, we are back here. Like we mentioned before, what we did, we created our first user, which is a global owner. We created an organization, we created a project, and created a cluster. Like we mentioned before, this is not all that you can do. There's a whole set of features around both user management, security, and teams backup and monitoring. Some of the things that I'm gonna go over here quite quickly. We have continuous backup support. You have snapshots, restore jobs. You can automate how you do backup through the CLI. Here's kind of a quick example. You can list the snapshots that you have for your cluster. Then you can create an automated restore from one project to another. So you could imagine scripting, replicating clusters across projects, and then using backup to restore that information. It's also not only about getting the cluster, you can also get monitoring for your different processes. So you have these metrics, database metrics, all this different information, you can get it through the CLI. Again, quick example here, you get Mongo CLI Ops Manager metrics process. You specify the host name that you want the information from, and you have a couple of flags on how granular you want that information. Another interesting feature, if you're setting up alerts and events for your infrastructure, you can automate all of these things through the CLI, how you configure your alerts, how you acknowledge those things, and how you fetch what's going on in terms of systems. Just before we go, I want to remind you that MongoCLI is completely open source. So head over to github.com/mongodb/mongocli. There you're gonna have our source code. Please feel free to contribute back to the project for whatever feature that you would like to see sooner than later. We welcome contribution from anybody. At the same time, if maybe coding it yourself is not your thing, we have a feedback forum where we are always listening to your ideas. So head over to tinyurl.com/mcli feedback and please submit your ideas. Thank you very much. That has been everything. Have a great day.